I did not expect the night to split open inside a corner booth at a 24-hour diner. Yet the door banged on its hinge, and a gust of sleet swarmed the linoleum like a small blizzard in a glass box. And before I could decide whether to duck or run, a man crossed the checkerboard floor with the calm of someone who has walked through worse weather than this city can manufacture, slipped a heavy wool blanket over my shoulders as if he had always known my exact shape, and said in a voice that carried warmth and warning in the same breath, "Stand with me," which would have been a strange kindness if the plate glass hadn't reflected two figures in dark coats shouldering through the storm of streetlight and ice, with faces I recognized from the kind of trouble that gets you handcuffed without a reason. And I swear that for one suspended second time thickened like syrup, while the chrome napkin holder threw my mirror reflection back at me. Lenore Winslow, foster home survivor, clinic volunteer by default, penthouse nanny by necessity, girl who has learned to wear resilience like armor, and I felt the old phantom weight of chains across my wrists, even though the metal had been gone for years, and the only thought I could form was a shocked and unholy question that tasted like iron. Why does a stranger know the line that has chased me out of sleep since I was 15 years old? He did not ask permission to pull me to my feet, because the luxury SUV idling at the curb was already bleeding its headlights across the cracked sidewalk, turning the wet asphalt into an imitation of a frozen river, and in that pale glare I caught the expression of the two men pushing in behind him, the same bored predatory patience I had memorized on private security at penthouse doors where I changed sheets and paraded innocence, the same practiced casual cruelty I had watched in foster kitchens where cabinets held more roaches than groceries, and the man with the blanket he is known in this city in a way you cannot Google, because his reputation is not a headline but a rumor shaped like a compass. They call him Dusk, and people who speak his name tend to lower their voice, not from fear but from respect. Earned the hard way, moved without hurry while he kept the blanket's weight centered on my back, so that I felt against skin that did not expect gentleness. A steady living heat that began to unknot the survival mode that has run my blood for a decade, and he said one sentence to the men in coats that did not sound like a threat, because true consequences never need volume. You can leave her here and walk out upright, or you can take your chances in the storm you brought with you. And the diner went as quiet as a church where someone has just told the truth no one wanted to say. If this were the kind of fairy tale love story the internet pretends to want, the luxury car would dissolve into fog, the street lights would halo like a coronation, and I would suddenly glow with trust and forgiveness. Yet the story I live has never paid out miracles. It explores what happens when vulnerability meets the wrong house at the wrong hour. It asks whether loneliness can be healed by a second chance, or whether redemption is just a word people use when they want you to swallow abandonment and call it character growth. And while my hands shook under the wool, I tamped panic into manageable shapes because I have learned that emotional intimacy does not arrive with fireworks but with unspoken connection built in quiet transformations, and the stranger's blanket felt less like rescue and more like a letter of truth pressed against my shoulders, a letter that said, "You do not have to be brave alone tonight." The men in coats did not back up. They slid sideways to block the door as if the city belonged to them by lease and lineage, the taller one flexing his jaw in that particular way that says he has practiced violence until it looks like a shrug, and when he reached into his pocket with the lazy confidence of someone who expects the room to forgive him in advance. Dusk's left hand lifted with the smallest motion, not toward a weapon because bravado is for amateurs, but toward the neon sign whose buzz had been bleeding into my skull since midnight, and with a flick of fingers that looked like nothing and everything, The diner was briefly washed in darkness while the emergency lights stuttered and died into an amber dimness, which meant the two coats had to adjust their eyes, while the blanket's edge tightened over my collarbone so that I was anchored in a way that felt like recognition, and the waitress behind the counter, who has seen enough Thursday nights to qualify as clergy, murmured, "Honey," and pushed a paper envelope toward my coffee because she has been saving my life with small graces all winter. I did not open the envelope because I understood its weight without reading the handwriting. I had left a letter for myself years ago inside a Foster desk carved with hearts and curses, a letter that said, if you ever need proof that you are more than what they called you, look for the mirror. And the mirror tonight was not polished steel or smoked glass, but the blank surface of a window where two worlds bled together. The city's faceless attraction to luxury cars and penthouse emptiness on one side, and the clinic of second chances, where I log volunteer hours, on the other. The city's appetite for stories that pretend forgiveness is the same as safety, and my own stubborn demand that trust must be earned over time. And when dusk said again, not louder, just closer, "Stand with me," I realized that the words were not a command so much as a doorway into a bond that might be slow and might be impossible, and might be the one honest way to stop living exclusively at an emotional distance from my own life. Outside, the sleet thickened into a kind of urban snow that made the street lights pulse like beacons and turned the sidewalk into a field of glittering glass shards. And the SUV's engine coughed once, as if a decision had been made that would cost someone a job. And I saw, reflected in the window, the luxury behind those tinted doors, the leather, the discreet bottle of imported water, the hush that pretends money can muffle the ache of hidden pain. And I remembered walking through penthouse empties after midnight with a bag of laundry and a prayer that the man who came home drunk would stumble past me without deciding I owed him conversation. And I thought of the clinic's waiting room at dawn, where the coffee is burned and hope tastes like paper cups, and where people come looking for healing that does not fit on a form. And I understood that both places are powerful in different ways and that both have tried to name me, yet neither has earned the right to keep me. The taller coat spoke at last because silence forces men like him to perform. And he said a name that was not mine because the file on their phone still listed me under a caseworker's typo. And he added a believable lie about an apartment I had never visited. And his partner glanced at the blanket with that curled lip contempt reserved for anything that looks like comfort in a world that worships hardness. And dusk did not move the way a fighter moves, but the way a guardian stands, which is to say he gave them a choice without filling the air with threat. And in the soft hum that followed, I felt the diner's handful of witnesses choose sides with their breath, not because they knew me, but because people who have been hungry recognize the physics of predation, even when it wears a suit. My body wanted to vanish. Survival mode whispered that disappearing is smarter than trust, that emotional scars do not heal when you look them in the eye, that personal growth is better as a caption than a risk. However, there is a kind of recognition that knocks on your life exactly once and asks whether you will keep reenacting the old abandonment, or whether you will try a second chance even if the price is terror. And I remembered a missed connection at this same counter 2 months ago when a man in a hood left his phone by the sugar, and I had almost followed him into the rain to deliver it. And on his cracked lock screen, a photograph had shown a boy standing in the desert, wrapped in a buffalo-patterned blanket, while a man in shadow braced against a wind I could practically taste. And when I touched the screen, the image had shifted to a reflection of my own face in the glass, which was so ridiculous I laughed, and then I shoved the memory into the drawer where I keep everything I cannot afford to need. Yet I know now that the man who reclaimed the phone was the one standing beside me tonight, and the photograph was not a random background but a letter of truth I did not recognize. A siren lifted somewhere south where the river staggers around the financial district, and the ultraviolet wash of a patrol car turned the sleet, a weird anti-halo that made everyone's skin look like a science fiction nightmare, which is the moment the taller coat put 2 fingers to his earpiece and nodded once, because someone had just told him the optics were bad, and the timing worse, and his partner muttered something about another day. And when they pivoted toward the door, Dusk breathed out as if a single weight had been redistributed across an entire winter, not because he feared them, but because restraint is always more expensive than spectacle. And I felt the blanket's pressure change, a subtle loosening that said he would never hold me with anything I did not choose. I wanted to ask who sent him and whether he knew my file and why the line he used, "Stand with me," felt like it had been written in the marrow of a story older than both of us, the kind of story that explores forgiveness without pretending it is painless, that names resilience without glamorizing suffering, that allows emotional intimacy to grow slowly, like ivy on brick, rather than exploding like fireworks on a rooftop. And I wanted to ask why the part of me that believes in faceless attraction, and in attraction that begins before names and fights its own skepticism, felt awake and afraid. And I wanted to ask whether redemption is something you choose or something that chooses you. However, questions are a luxury when the night is still moving, so I swallowed them with the last of the cold coffee and asked the one that mattered, "If I stand with you now, what do I owe you later?" And he answered in that same even tone that handled me and the men and the storm with equal steadiness. "Nothing you do not agree to in words." We stepped out from the warm neon into the street where the sleet stung like sand, and the city smelled of wet brakes and diesel and steak frites grease, and the blanket's edge flapped once like a flag before I trapped it against my ribs. And somewhere a street light clicked into its next cycle so that the whole block shifted shade like a stage trick, and the SUV pulled away because its calculus had changed. And I walked beside the stranger who had made himself responsible without making me property, and I recognized that the choice to open up after years of closing off is not a single theatrical act, but a series of small permissions granted to yourself. And as we passed the window, I could not help looking at the mirror again, not to admire or condemn, but to confirm that I existed. And the glass did me the favor of returning a woman who was not a child and not a case file and not an ornament in anyone's penthouse, and not a ghost haunting clinics and laundromats, a woman with bruised pasts and hidden pain who was no longer willing to live at an emotional distance from her own life. We made it as far as the corner where the cracked sidewalk heaves around a tree root, and then the city did that theatrical thing it loves where 2 worlds meet, because a black town car drifted to a halt across the crosswalk with theatrical patience. The rear door opened without a face showing, and on the leather seat, a single envelope waited with my legal name printed in the old social worker's cursive, and I knew from the weight of the paper and the audacity of the gesture that this was a letter of truth written by someone who wanted to own my next decision. And I also knew that if I took one more step, I would be choosing not only a direction but a definition. And Dusk's voice was quiet enough that it did not reach farther than my shoulder when he said, "You do not have to read what they think you are." And I realized the first 60 seconds of this night were not a rescue or a romance, but an audition for trust earned over time. And I put my hand toward the open door without taking the envelope, because sometimes the only way to see what a city wants from you is to make it say the request out loud. What would you do if the past you survived sent a car to collect you and called it forgiveness, and the future you might deserve stood beside you in the sleet asking nothing but your consent? The envelope waited on the black leather like a dare that had learned to spell my legal name better than any social worker ever managed. And while the door of the town car held its patient mouth open to the sleet, and the streetlights flickered in that tired rhythm the city uses when it wants you to mistake surveillance for mercy, I slid the paper into my palm with the same care I would use to lift a sleeping child. felt dusk shift just enough behind my shoulder to keep the blanket cupped around my ribs, and unfolded the letter of truth that pretended to be paperwork but read like a weapon, because the first page was a photocopy of a guardianship petition that Harlan Pike had filed when I aged out and started working in penthouse empties, claiming protective interest with signatures I recognized in their arrogance. And the second page was not illegal at all, but an inkjet photo of a girl I did not want to be anymore. Me at 15 under a sky that looks like winter even in summer, wrapped in a patterned wool that rhymes with the one holding me now. A mirror reflection of a survival I never asked for, while a phone number scrawled at the bottom promised conversation and forgiveness in the same handwriting that once itemized my belongings like inventory, which is how I knew the forgiveness would cost more than I was willing to pay. I kept my voice measured because survival mode demands theatrical calm. Told Dusk that Pike wanted me to climb into curated warmth and call it home, and watch the window give back a layered city where luxury cars idle like predators and cracked sidewalks write biographies of people who learned resilience one stumble at a time. And in that glass I saw a miniature of us, a woman, trained by abandonment to distrust rescue, a man who wears steadiness like wool and weather, an unspoken connection built from the kind of eye contact that does not flinch. And I heard my inner narrator slip into the language of the story I swore I would not tell. The one that explores deep emotional themes like vulnerability and trust and loneliness and healing and second chances and redemption and recognition and forgiveness and resilience and emotional intimacy and unspoken connection, the one rooted in survival mood and bruised pasts, and faceless attraction and emotional scars, and personal growth and quiet transformations and hidden pain and emotional distance, and the gradual building of a slow bond that refuses fairy tale shortcuts. And I hated that the SEO of my life read so clearly across the wet glass while the city pretended to be neutral. The driver's silhouette moved as if he had been trained to make decisions appear inevitable. The door angled closer to shut me in. And because I have learned that missed connections are not always romantic, so much as survival choices disguised as coincidence, I stepped back enough that the blanket's edge tugged at my collarbone and asked Dusk whether stand with me meant loyalty or geography, whether I was a cause, a case, or a person, and he answered in that pared-down grammar of men who prefer actions to slogans that he was walking to the clinic of second chances, because the night had already tried to claim one too many names, and that I could walk beside him or behind him or not at all, but that if I chose beside him he would match my pace and keep his hands visible, because trust earned over time needs proof measured step by step rather than promises thrown like blankets across strangers. And while he spoke, I realized how long it had been since anyone offered me a plan that did not assume obedience. We moved under the broken neon and past the diner where grease smells like forgiveness and coffee tastes like burnt hope, crossed a crosswalk where the white paint is more ghost than stripe, and cut along a block of storefronts where the windows show shoes no one wears down these cracked sidewalks. And as we walked, the city staged its favorite chorus of ambient threats, men talking too loud into phones to prove they matter, glass grinding under tires, a luxury car crawling at the speed of a decision, and I kept reading the night like a file because I have learned the grammar of danger. Spotted the second SUV 3 blocks up, marked the alley with the busted camera, counted bodies in hoodies on the stoop, and only then let my eyes drift to the upper floors, where penthouse empties stare down like orphaned gods, sharp and silent, while somewhere behind us the town car shut its door in a way that informed the air it would try again. The clinic's block is what passes for mercy in this city. A squat building with a mural that peels in the rain, and a lobby that smells like bleach in winter, where quiet hands works nights because healing is not a schedule but a stubbornness, and where a bulletin board carries letters of truth from clients who graduated to less fragile days. And I know the security guard on Tuesdays, and the old man who naps in the afternoon, but tonight the glass door was chained from the inside with a sign that apologized for a staffing shortage, while the waiting room lights burned anyway. And when I lifted my palm to the sensor, I saw my reflection tremble once and stilled it by force, because I am tired of letting mirrors write my mood, and Dusk's knuckles tapped a pattern on the side door that I did not recognize, which is how I learned he knows more entrances than the public does. And seconds later, Crow on Wind slid the bolt with 50 different versions of worry in his eyes because he is young enough to think speed can outrun winter. Quiet Hands drew me through the hallway with the tenderness of someone who has learned not to ask too many questions until a person can breathe, checked my wrists without making me feel inspected, passed me a cup of water that tasted more like decision than hydration, and listened while I sketched the outline of Pike's promise, in a voice that kept trying to sound like someone who knows what she is doing. And when she said that abandonment often returns dressed as recognition and that not all rescues are rescues, I felt the blanket seem to warm another degree, even though physics would disagree, and I found myself admitting in a blur that the man beside me had once appeared as a lock screen ghost months ago, and that perhaps my life has been flickering toward this slow burn intersection longer than I wanted to believe, which embarrassed me because I prefer to narrate personal growth after it is safe rather than while it is happening. Crow on Wind reported what I already suspected from the hum at the base of my skull, that the black SUV had circled the block twice without choosing a lane, that a second car waited where the alley spits you onto the river road, that a third signal sat cold in the parking bay under the condos across from the clinic, and Dusk listened without showing the kind of adrenaline that makes boys loud, then told us we would not stage a movie scene or escalate a script that loves spectacle, that we would choose a quiet transformation instead, that we would exit through the rear service door, cut across the loading dock, and take the long, lit route where streetlights make predators visible and where the cameras can be worked in our favor. And I watched the plan lay itself down like a path that respects fear but does not kneel to it. I asked whether this was the part of the story where forgiveness calls my phone and I answer against my better judgment, whether the letter in the car would become a key that unlocks a new set of chains called gratitude, whether redemption requires an audience to count as real. And Dusk said that forgiveness is a private room, not a public ceremony, that resilience is not a costume, and that love, which defies fairy tale tropes, rarely arrives with trumpet music, but prefers the silence presence of two people walking through weather without pretending they control the sky. And I thought of foster homes where logic is a rumor, of penthouse stairs where footsteps echo like verdicts, of the clinic where the word second chance is written in 10 languages above a bucket of mops, and I realized that the only way to test emotional intimacy is to risk being seen when there is nothing to trade. We reached the service corridor where paint curls from cinder block pushed the crash bar that screams even when you pray it won't, and stepped into an alley that smelled of river damp and salt trucks, and I had just breathed a little easier because the street lights did their halogen hum and the loading dock gave us a slope to follow when the town car eased into view sideways like a chess piece sliding into the square it was promised. The rear door unlatched without a face showing, and a voice that did not need to be loud to be final said my name with the old authority of paperwork and money, Lenore Winslow, and followed it with a reminder that sounded like a verdict. Your case is still active. Before my knees decided whether to lock or run, I saw, inside the car's dim, the edge of a familiar patterned wool folded like an accusation, which meant either they had stolen history to manipulate me, or history refuses to let go, and I had to decide whether I was going to let the past write the rest of my night. If the man who wrote my file can still call the storm by my name, and the man who offered me a blanket refuses to call me anything I do not choose. Then which door do I close? And which door do I open before this city decides for me? Warmth is not weather. Warmth is a decision someone makes to share their life with you. And when dusk settled the course, the smoke-scented wool across my shoulders with a practiced sweep that tucked the edge beneath my collarbone and let the weight rest. Where breath panics first, the first honest heat in hours pressed my ribs back into rhythm while sleet needled the fabric and steam from the horse rose like a small altar in the wind. And the hired men actually faltered as if the ground had tilted because the storm's beat stuttered around the ordinary miracle of a body placing itself between harm and cold rather than reaching for spectacle. Memory intruded with the precision of a lantern lit in a dark shed. My father's jacket thrown over me when fences were still arguments and not verdicts. The towel my mother used to chase thaw from my hair, the last human shelter I knew before Pike's men made possession sound like law, and then the present reasserted itself in the angle of Dusk's shoulder catching the gale, in the way he placed the horse to blunt the sleet, in the quiet choreography of practical tenderness that declared without flourish that care is a skill and not a speech. He spoke in a tone that made even the wind lean closer, stating that the storm would kill us all faster than pride could save face, that a mile from here dry rock and stacked wood waited for any who were willing to live until morning, that releasing me now cost less than being found under a drift at dawn, and that he would not barter my body to purchase anyone's comfort, which should have sounded like deliverance and yet landed like an insult on men who confuse mercy with insult and shelter with trickery. While they translated restraint into weakness, I tested my legs under the blanket steadying, gravity, feeling the old reflex to perform resilience as solitude wrestle with the recognition that survival without recognition is only a longer exile, and I chose to stand with the unglamorous resolve of someone who has run long enough, my knees soft as thawing bark, and my hands flinching for the wool, which dusk adjusted with a small, exact tug that freed my forearms and tightened warmth across the sternum while leaving my shoulders unpinned because consent does not wear knots. He repeated the maply of the rock, banked fire, breath before bravado, yet the taller man hardened his jaw into the hinge of humiliation, and the younger one tasted the moment as if violence were a flavor he deserved. And when their eyes slid to the blanket with that peculiar contempt men reserve for comfort they cannot control, they called it a trick, and came on with elbows sharpened by habit rather than skill, boots chewing the brittle crust and pride outrunning breath until the whole rush smelled like a bad lesson repeating itself. The phantom weight of links flickered along my wrists exactly as the fabric's heat steadied my spine, and in that layered sensation I understood how this night had entered the territory of the themes I pretend not to narrate. Vulnerability made visible rather than punished, trust measured in inches, loneliness acknowledged without spectacle, the possibility of healing as discipline instead of miracle, the second chance that looks like shelter and costs somebody pride, the recognition that I am someone and not inventory, the delayed forgiveness that refuses debt, resilience that prefers quiet transformations over rooftop pronouncements, the first small spark of an unspoken connection that might choose to become intimacy if it is allowed the time to breathe. And I held my ground because sometimes holding is the loudest thing you can do without raising your voice. Dusk's hand moved toward steel with the understatement of a craftsman who counts consequences before he lifts a tool, yet his voice reached the space between us first, and laid a boundary the storm itself seemed to respect, not a shout but a clear sentence that promised life without pleading and consequence without theater, a line you could step away from with your breath intact if you valued mourning more than audience. "Walk away," he says, "or the storm will bury what I leave." Some men reach for iron to feel large, some speak softly and make their enemies smaller, and when the taller one converted contempt into motion, he met a pivot rather than a wall. His weight redirected through Dusk's hips so cleanly that breath exploded from his mouth in a white burst before his knees consented to fold, the snow taking the sound with a decorum that made the result feel inevitable rather than dramatic, while the younger man sliced in quicker and still found only a forearm like a gate swinging shut. A short strike that tipped his balance into the drift where anger became labor and labor cooled his certainty with a sting that felt a lot like learning. Steel appeared only as punctuation because Dusk lifted the cutter, bit the chain, and tucked the tool away, in a single sentence of motion that left the links clattering into the crust, like the brittle syllables of an old story ending. And when the last ring stopped skittering, the silence that followed said, "What paperwork never had that I would not be inventory again." And then he hauled the younger man out of the lee before panic could turn to suffocation, pressing 3 plain instructions about breath and boots into him as if returning a borrowed life without interest. I considered running because flight is a muscle I strengthened in foster kitchens and penthouse corridors. Yet the blanket's weight proposed a braver economy, and I stepped to Dusk's windshield side with a choice that surprised even me, deciding to remain visible inside my own rescue rather than vanishing from it, and he made room without ceremony, already turning the moment from skirmish to housekeeping, as he nudged a pistol deeper under the drift, cracked a rifle to spill its teeth into the snow, and laid the emptied body of it across a sage stub like a warning to ideas that mistake tools for power. The horse answered a low whistle with a bent-knee kneel that brought the saddle into the reach of hips that did not want to be humbled and were anyway, and I climbed clumsy and chose to climb regardless, leather creaking while the blanket found new folds, and the animal's heat rose through my shins until the sway beneath me became a grammar my body could learn on the move, which is when names traveled between us as bearings rather than boasts. His winds at dusk offered like a landmark, and my Lenore Winslow spoken in a tone that admitted ownership for the first time in months. He said Harlan Pike's name with the accuracy of a bruise pressed, explained without ornament that the men who dragged me hire their courage with his coin and dress his grudges in uniforms when law will oblige and in favors when it won't, and the knowledge did not ignite fury so much as begin a thaw along old nerves, a slow ache that signaled motion returning to places I had taught myself to ignore, while the snow behind us closed over the fallen links almost as quickly as they cooled. Mercy and erasure braided together in a way that demanded I remember the sound even if the world agreed to hide the sight. We turned the horse toward the darker ridge where rock lifts into weather and offers shelter that winter never gives cheaply, the wind shouldering us one last time across a lip of ground that would not forgive carelessness. And then the land opened into a shallow bowl that softened the storm into echo, and Dusk raised his hand in a signal I did not yet know, as 2 silhouettes unwove themselves from juniper crow, on wind ahead and left, quiet hands behind and right moving with the seamless attention of people who have spent fear already in practice so their bodies can afford calm when it is needed. Behind us, no one followed, whether because paychecks do not include becoming a cautionary tale or because the weather had convinced pride to postpone, and the air inside the blanket loosened enough that my lungs could deepen while the horse steadied to a rhythm that felt older than any quarrel, the slow intimacy of staying alive together, replacing the gaudy panic that had tried to write my fate at the diner door. And as the bowl accepted us, the pale ahead shifted from iron to amber, a living seam of fire stitching wind to stone and promising shelter that would warm hands and sharpen judgment in the same breath. Firelight flickers ahead, and with it, the weight of other eyes I learned to survive before I learned his language. His shoulders taught me shelter mile by mile, because the ride became a moving lesson in how to keep breath and body from shattering under weather that wants to file you down to nothing. And dusk without speechifying, without glancing back to see whether I was keeping up with his courage, showed me where to pinch the blanket's edge under my collar so the wind would skim rather than snake, how to fold the wool across the sternum in a diagonal that traps heat without trapping fear, how to match the horse's long exhale so my lungs learned the rhythm of an animal that trusts winter enough to move through it, and how to angle my face away from the spindrift so needles of ice struck leather and hat brim, and not raw skin that would remember the sting longer than it deserved. When my fingers began to fail, the easy tests numb first, then foolish. He caught my hands the way a medic does, not asking permission because frostbite never waits for yes, pressing each fingertip until sensation returned like a reluctant confession, rubbing life along the tendons with a triage intimacy that refused to turn my pain into a performance. And when I flinched from the heat that comes back ugly before it comes back true, he said nothing sanctimonious, only repositioned the wool so the ache could do its work quieter, which is a kind of mercy I had not known to ask for. Afterward, as we slid along the pale behind a stand of juniper, I noticed a small charm on the bridle, a beadwork river running toward a brass feather, both dulled by winter and use, and I decided not to ask what it meant, because I have learned that not every symbol is a riddle strangers earn the right to solve on first sight. The sky above us was blank in the way city ceilings are blank before dawn, a low lid that erases stars and insists direction is an act of faith. Yet dusk read its gradients as if there were letters there, catching the way the wind braided itself across the prairie, finding the darker seam where ground lifts a little into shelter. And I began to understand that knowing is a kind of map, that fluency in place is the difference between wandering and arriving, that I have spent years translating people and paperwork while the land remained a language I never learned because I was too busy staying unclaimed. Then the ground itself whispered a change, a shadowed outcrop taking shape through the static of snow, and a thin, improbable thread of smoke stitched the gray together into a promise the storm could not untie. They appeared the way competent help always does, not as a shock but as a correction to danger. Crow on wind sliding from juniper with eyes already counting problems and exits, quiet hands a breath behind, moving with the steady economy of someone whose work is more repair than spectacle, and my chest tightened at the sight of them, because we were entering another people's circle while I wore their leader's blanket like a declaration, and I have lived the kind of life where borrowed shelter often carries a bill written in a language that only reveals its price at the door. Dusk felt my spine turn to glass and said, in the even tone that keeps storms from deciding for you, to stay close and not confuse curiosity with threat, to let questions be air rather than knives, to remember that staring is sometimes only the way a community takes your measure when gossip has not had time to form. We slid along the rock's windward face until the cliff shouldered the gale up and over us with a noise like surf, dismounted into drifts that accepted our shins without malice, and ducked beneath a shelf where stone and brush made a room that existed because weather had carved it, and people had decided to add intention poles driven, tarps roped, a banked pit that still remembered last night's fire, and the instant the flame shouldered up from coals into a living sheet, heat hit the damp wool and my cheekbones and the raw skin at my wrists like a blow that landed tenderness first and then ache, and with it came the eyes that belonged to any shelter worth the name, weighing, sorting, testing what story my presence would force them to carry. Heat hits like a blow, and so do the stares. Fire warms hands and burns lies off the tongue, and inside the shelter the proof lived in the way work organized itself without orders. The quiet industry of people who know winter better than they know argument. Tools nested where hands reach blind. A stew shouldering its way from simmer to hunger on a tripod blackened by seasons. Boot scrapes tamped into paths that told a map of habit. and the susurrus of tasks water-handed. Wood split, gear Eunice threaded through the space like a low song that made speech unnecessary until speech mattered. In that arrangement, Dusk's arrival shifted the air not through volume but through the gravity of reputation, because when he vouched for me he did it with measured words rather than borrowed thunder. Naming the road behind us, the offer he gave the men who would not take it, the fact of the chain without turning my wrists into a spectacle, and I watched how the weight of his name moved across faces like a weather change everyone had already predicted. It would have been easier to shrink into wool and steam, yet I have learned that possession thrives on silence, so I said my name again, Lenore Winslow, with more breath and less apology than I had used at the diner. Owned it in front of witnesses who mattered because they would be the ones repeating the story when we were not in the room. And quiet hands met me at that plank I had just thrown across a gap with a jar of balm that smelled of resin and smoke. Bound my wrists with cloth as soft as kindness, and when the sting bit hard enough to make me flinch, I kept my face open, because I am tired of apologizing for bleeding, even as my body practiced the old reflex to say sorry before it has confirmed harm. She did not scold the reflex out of me or reward it either, only pressed warmth until the pulse steadied, which in its refusal to dramatize pain felt like a lesson in dignity. Food arrived with the logic of weather stew ladled, meat and roots, speaking the grammar of calories I had not had to earn in hours. And as I ate, I recognized the drift of trade in the objects around us. Tin mugs, stamped with a Street Lewis maker's mark. A length of cloth dyed the blue, I know from general stores. A knife haft I had seen in a trader's case, proof that borders leak in both directions, and that purity is a fantasy upheld by people who have never been cold. Dusk let me finish 2 careful mouthfuls before asking how I came to be chained, and I gave the sharp version because I know the cost of over-explaining. Told them Pike's grievance over land hardened into claim over body, and that paperwork and men with time on their hands conspire more efficiently than storms, that I made the mistake of assuming silence would count as refusal, and that the city loves a story where a woman becomes an object if the ending looks clean on paper. He answered not with a speech but with a loss, a nephew taken by Winter River years back, the sort of grief that shapes a man's verbs without turning him into a statue, a line offered without decoration, and the hush that followed was the hush a room gives honest weight, not the hush of performative sadness, which meant it landed where it needed to, and because the human body craves bridges. When cold has thinned its bravado, I tried a Comanche word I had practiced in my head and ruined it at the first vowel, which is how Crow on Wind earned his quick grin and a correction gentle enough to keep my dignity intact. Plank laid across water, an invitation to learn without acting entitled to fluency. Tasks resumed as if confession were only one more chore to be sorted into the hour, and in that rhythm Dusk said, with the same evenness he used on the trail and in the standoff, that at first light we would go before the council because power accountable to no one curdles in winter faster than meat, that he owed his people an explanation for what he had decided on their behalf, and that I would not be smuggled into safety by the back door of gratitude, but asked to stand where decisions can see daylight, and although my stomach pulled tight at the thought of faces weighing me again, I felt a steadier heat under the fear because whatever this shelter was offering me, it was not false protection bought with silence. At dawn, he says, I answer to my people and so will you. Dawn did not break the storm. It merely made us easier to judge, because as the light thinned the gray into paler layers, and the wind lost its edge without surrendering its will, we rode into a village that had already begun its day against winter's appetite. Dogs trotting their perimeter with the low commentary of creatures who take attendance by scent, children bundled and purposeful ferrying kindling and water, women and men moving in the work-song rhythm of chores that make survival feel almost like order, the smoke of breakfast fires threading upward with the humility of something necessary rather than celebratory. And in that lived choreography I felt my own breath lengthen under the blanket as if my ribs were trying to learn the village's meter. Dusk's arrival changed the air the way a weather front changes a field, without pageantry, but with an unmistakable pressure that straightened backs and quieted conversations. Hands paused halfway to lashings and ladles, glances tipped from curiosity to accounting. A path opened as if the ground had chosen a leader rather than a man had claimed it, and the silence that gathered around us was not hostile so much as disciplined. The kind of quiet that knows noise is expensive when the day is cold and decisions are dear. We passed between lodges to a cleared space ringed by posts hung with winter hides, a council place that felt less like a stage than like a forge's heart, warm from many uses and strict about what could be made upon it. Elders settled with the gravity of people who have rehearsed wisdom until it can be worn without ornament. And among them, Winter Speaker lifted his chin as if to acknowledge not merely our arrival but the obligation it carried. His eyes steady in the way of those who understand that leadership is a ledger you balance aloud. Dusk did not borrow thunder or reach for grandeur. He stated facts with the plainness that allows them to bear weight, recounting my capture without dressing my wrists in pity. Naming the offer he gave Pike's men without pretending it was magnanimity, explaining the cut chain without daring the room to applaud, and I listened to the economy of his report with the grateful dread of a woman who knows how easily speeches about her body can turn into property claims, and felt the first real mercy of the morning in his refusal to turn me into an argument. An elder whose braid flashed iron gray in the weak sun asked why I was among them at all, whether I had been brought as evidence or as burden, and before Dusk could answer for me, I chose to answer for myself, because silence has been the knife used most neatly against me, saying my name, Lenore Winslow, in a tone stronger than the diner and not yet free of tremor, admitting that I did not know the law that would judge me here, that ignorance is not innocence, but at least it is honest, and asking to be measured by what I would do now rather than by the paper that has been used to misname me, because I am finished being an object in other people's files. A woman elder whose hands were stained with the practical dyes of work tilted her face toward the east, where the light gathered, and asked the only question that matters. When people talk about safety with their mouths full of euphemism, what I would do if my own people arrived to demand me, whether I would allow their insistence to decide my body again, and I said as plainly as I could without mistaking courage for theater, that I would not return to Harlan Pike, that I would stand where my breath is not counted as someone else's asset, that I would answer for my choices but not for his grievances. Murmurs moved the ring like wind through Reed's calculations you could almost hear. Inventories of corn and meat, tallies of grudges and weather, the arithmetic of retaliation that winter makes ugly because every loss is proportionally larger when the world is already lean, and fear of Pike's temper was named aloud by a hunter with frostburn on his cheek and by a mother whose eyes darted toward the stores. And I respected the honesty of it because it is easier to prepare for a danger once it has been given a mouth. Dusk asked for temporary protection with the steadiness of a man who knows exactly what his request will cost him, not because he doubted his people but because he refused to hide the bill, stating that the responsibility would sit on his shoulders first and last, that any harm my presence drew should be reckoned against his name, and that choosing to keep me safe among them was not an act of charity but of order, because the storm that nearly killed us had taught him again the lesson he already lived by. Pride is a poor blanket. The decision landed without celebration and without delay. A nod from Winter Speaker, a lifted palm from the woman elder, a collective exhale that sounded like consent hammered flat, and the words that followed carried the edge of both mercy and warning. The council grants protection until dusk, when both sides will meet within sight of everyone. By noon, rumor runs faster than horses. By evening, it burns hotter than any hearth, and the first proof arrived on Crow, on Wind's breath as he slid from the ridge with snow throttling his lashes, and Pike's name riding the wind behind him, reporting a settler search party angling along the river road with the patience of men who believe the land owes them a corridor, and the confidence of those who have not yet been taught their appetite has a weather limit. I did the only thing that has ever given me back a portion of my name, which is work. I carried water in sloshing skins that slapped my knees and reminded me that warmth is weight. I helped quiet hands brush ice from fetlocks and check hooves for the packed stones that turn horses into heartbreak. I stood in the lee of a lodge and learned to repair a windbreak seam with fingers that fumbled then obeyed. And in that steady sequence labor became language, and the room I occupied felt less borrowed and more earned, not because anyone crowned me with acceptance, but because usefulness keeps panic from writing your story for you. Human texture stitched itself into the day whether I invited it or not. A child stood at semi-attention 5 paces away and stared not at my face but at dusk's blanket with the grave curiosity of someone trying to decode how a symbol travels from one body to another without losing its meaning. And an old man with hands like dry bark sidled close enough to show me a better knot for the windbreak line, his voice as gentle as a whetstone as he explained that the wind respects angles more than strength, a lesson I have tried and failed to learn in other forms for most of my life. I overheard the fears that run on their own legs when winter shortens tempers, talk of stores and how many more weeks the meat must stretch, of Parley lines that have held for seasons and might fray under Pike's ambitions, of which cousins and nephews might be the first to chase hot talk into cold action. And I recognized in those murmurs the same ledger that flickers behind every clinic intake and every foster placement, the assessment of risk and resource that people pretend is impersonal when it is in fact personal enough to bruise. Dusk balanced factions without performing balance, listening longer than anyone else and then abridging the temperature rather than the facts, offering those who trusted his judgment a chance to rest while giving those who feared my presence as a spark, the dignity of being heard without permitting their alarm to become policy. And I watched how often leadership is simply the refusal to let panic choose the verb. When my legs threatened to translate dread into flight, I rehearsed the truth that running would set fire to both sides, that absence is as inflammatory as presence when people need a face to blame. And I stayed, not because staying felt noble, but because it was the only decision that did not multiply harm. Crow on Wind marked the Parley ground at the meadow's lip where the snow lies shallow enough to hide no weapons, and the distance between lines allows for words to travel without becoming accusations, driving stakes with strips of cloth that made rules visible in a language even anger can read. We agreed on terms with the care of people who know how quickly terms become loopholes, weapons laid aside in plain view, many witnesses instead of a secret quorum, no sudden moves that would invite reflex to masquerade as intent. And the tasks that sprang from those terms gave everyone something to hold besides fear. The storm, perhaps jealous of losing the lead in this story, thickened again as the afternoon sloped toward its darker half, the sky lowering until the world felt closer, and the wind combed our hair with a colder hand, and the last of the preparations, mugs of broth distributed to mouths that needed steadiness more than taste. Elders positioned where their eyes could govern the heat of younger blood, and watch stations set like punctuation along the ridge finished in a hush that held both dread and readiness without letting either spill. A horn echoed from the ridge, the settlers are here. Some oaths are spoken, Others are paid for with your standing. And when we stepped onto the Parley ground staked out by cloth strips and common sense, dusk opened not with declarations of honor or ancient injuries, but with the plain arithmetic of winter safety and de-escalation, naming how many nights of meat remained if nobody bled, how many children coughed when the wind came knife-edge off the ridge, how fast a quarrel becomes famine when pride is allowed to pretend it is policy. And from the way both circles held their breath, I understood that no one here intended to rehearse friendship, only to decide whether the season would be allowed to continue its work without our help. The familiar faces from my settlement arranged themselves along the far line in the order I always expected. Churchmen near the captain, traders at the middle distance, wives tight to one another as if proximity could shield them from rumor. And when some saw me standing tall in a stranger's blanket, their expressions loosened into unguarded relief, while most others narrowed into the hard judgment that mistakes mercy for betrayal. The old balance of our streetlights and cracked sidewalks and penthouse favors, tilting in a way I could feel in my ribs, even out here where the only buildings were wind and snow. Harlan Pike stepped forward as if the ground had been poured for his stride, speaking of claim and property and order with the patient, practiced cadence of a man who has hired his language so often it believes him without needing proof. And he said my name in the tone that makes a thing into an object, reminding the gathered that papers had been filed and signatures had been acquired, and that the city likes its files tidy and its women compliant. And though the words were winter smooth, I could hear the heat beneath them, the old grievance that wants to come in from the weather and sit by a fire made of me. I felt the blanket at my shoulders do what good shelter does hold without hiding, and I answered not with a speech, but with the truth of the storm and the blanket, saying that cold kills faster than pride, that I was alive because a man chose warmth over theater, that I would not return under Pike's authority because I was not a ledger line to be reconciled or a rumor to be domesticated, and that whatever forgiveness I owe will not be purchased with obedience. The words shook both circles in different ways, yet when the echo passed I felt the ground fix under my boots as if the land itself had accepted the weight of my standing. Dusk did the costed thing leaders do when the room needs a spine to lean on, staking his own name without flourish, stating that if harm came of keeping me, it would land on him first and last, that his shoulders would carry the account, that his choice was not charity but a boundary drawn for the sake of order. And although the sentence was neither long nor loud, the silence that followed gave it the ceremony of an oath because everyone present understood the currency being spent. The search captain, who has never wasted a winter for the sake of a headline, measured loss against pride, as if laying out powder and shot, squinting past Pike's rhetoric to the math of cold nights and thin stores, and he indicated in that grudging, sensible way of men who want to survive the season that peace could be managed if the rules were visible, if the fires were kept separate, if no one gave rumor a reason to become a posse, and his assent more practical than generous and therefore more trustworthy. We separated along a thread so thin it looked like breath in freezing air, the kind that can vanish if looked at wrong, and as the circles peeled back into their own weather, the eyes that tracked us promised this would not be over, that winter is long and tempers are longer, that the next chapter would ask for more than careful staging and good intentions. Dusk exhaled like a man who has bought time with his own credit and knows the interest is already accruing, and I felt the blankets settle a fraction deeper, as if the wool understood the ledger better than I did, and intended to pay what it could in heat. We turned toward the woodpile where the day's work ought to have been settled into neat ranks under snow, and the light shifted just enough for a truth to declare itself without words, because near the stacked logs something caught and threw back the pail, a needle of brightness where no brightness belonged, the unmistakable glint of steel lying where it should not lie. Storms do not vanish. They take rooms inside your ribs. And in the days after the Parley, I learned to belong by doing rather than by asking, rising into a rhythm that felt like a second language work. Learn, repeat without pretending to be what I am not, carrying water until the slosh trained my hips to balance, splitting, kindling to the tempo that keeps fingers attached, mending a windbreak seam beside a woman whose hands have argued with weather longer than my life, and letting labor translate me into something more useful than the rumor I had brought with me. Dusk taught survival craft with the patience of a man who believes skills are better inheritances than speeches, showing me how to read wind in grass and powder, how to coax flame from wet wood without turning pride into smoke, how to cut a trail so that the person behind you wastes less life with every step. And because my body has been schooled by fear rather than by craft, I failed early and publicly, then learned in increments until my breath synchronized with tasks rather than with panic. At night, the nightmares returned like creditors who know the back door, dragging chains across the floors of sleep until the old rooms inside me echoed, yet the blanket at my shoulders reframed warmth as a choice rather than a debt, pulling the cold out of my sternum in slow inches, reminding me that emotional intimacy is sometimes nothing more glamorous than shared heat and the unspoken promise that no one will turn it into leverage in the morning. I asked careful questions about law and custom because I have been burned by certainty, and answers came careful too, often preceded by silence, presence, and followed by a story rather than a rule, which taught me that respect is its own bridge, and that recognition, real recognition, arrives in pieces and requires patience from both sides. Some distrust remained, and I did not try to bruise it into belief. I accepted distance like weather and kept showing up, letting my hands argue my case while my mouth learned when to close. Children corrected my attempts at Comanche with merciless accuracy and the generosity of laughter that does not humiliate. New sounds entering my days until my tongue stopped treating them like foreign objects and started treating them like tools. And there were moments when I understood how quiet transformations are the only kind that last, how personal growth does not require a rooftop confession or a luxury car confession booth, but the slow stacking of ordinary hours in which no one makes you perform gratitude. Winter tightened like a belt another notch, and the hunting parties ranged farther for less, risk climbing in ways a ledger can record but not prevent, and leadership's cost became visible on dusk the way weather writes itself on rock-thinner cheeks, rougher hands, a stiffness in the shoulders that he tried to stretch away when he thought no one was watching, which is how I knew the oath he had paid with his standing was not a line he had delivered but a weight he carried. The first bad sign arrived folded into a scout's breath as he trotted in out of the pale, reporting caches raided and meat stolen and a pattern of boot marks that arranged themselves into taunts rather than hunger. Camp tarps slit not in haste but with the tidy meanness of someone sending a letter of truth designed to be read by the people he meant to frighten. And on a sapling near the ridge, a knife tip had carved a mark that looked like a grin and felt like a dare. I did not need anyone to translate the handwriting because I have been its subject before, and the old calculation that used to live in the penthouse elevators and the clinic intake line began to hum again in my chest. The one that asks what you are willing to pay to keep the peace from breaking on your body. We followed the scout's line into the drift where the wind had not yet sanded everything flat, and there in the shallow of a hoofprint lay a small, deliberate brightness against the blue-white no bigger than a coin, colder than the air, a broken chain link set where my eye could not help finding it, left like a signature on a threat that had learned to spell my name. Old stories do not die. They wait for new weather, and the raids taught us that truth with a meanness that felt deliberate, because each morning brought prints that did not belong to hunger but to performance. a mixed crew stepping wide to confuse count and stride, long striding drifters who carried their weight on the outside of their heels. One settler whose nails bit the mud in a way I remembered from town alleys. And, worst of all, the small, careful boot of someone who knew our windbreaks and caches with the intimacy of a map read by lamplight in safer seasons. A defector laying a neat breadcrumb line so the others could make theft look like accident and malice look like need. Meat vanished in measured cuts instead of ragged handfuls. Lashings were slit at angles that would make a repair, insult our patience, and the way they left the lids of bins slightly ajar told me someone wanted blood to answer blood, wanted us to come hot and loud and righteous into a trap that would feel like justice because it matched the temperature of our fear. On a cottonwood near the ridge I found a carved mark that did not belong to this side of the river, a shallow, ugly glyph I had seen burned into Pike's fence posts, the season he announced that the land would obey him even when the creek refused, and shame curdled into resolve so fast I could taste iron, because I had dragged that story across the snow with me without meaning to, because my name was being used as tinder on both fires, and because I refused to live as a rumor that keeps paying. I told Dusk I was joining the tracking party. He said no with the calm that expects to be obeyed, laid out, in a voice that did not rise, the ledger of risks my presence would add to a hunt already priced too high. And when I held his eyes and answered that running had never saved me and watching would not save us, he did not repeat himself. He set the firm conditions that make consent real. Stay where he puts me. Speak when he tells me. Retreat when he says the word, and then he allowed it, which is different than permitting it, because allowance implies faith as well as risk. We took the sign where the wind had not yet sanded the world into anonymity, and I contributed the way a useful stranger should, crouching to read the heel scuffs that tell you who slips when the snow hides the slope, predicting camp spots from the dirty geometry of men who nap where they shouldn't, calling out where a man had knelt too long to lace a boot because cold fingers refuse small tasks. And when my guesses landed, I earned nods instead of stares, a small currency that spent better than comfort. The trail sketched us toward a ravine where the wind braided itself into confusion and the snow lay in shallow drifts that could hide footprints without swallowing them. A good place to stage a lesson with witnesses, and we made a plan fit for winter rather than for ballads. No rush, no speeches, a quiet recovery that returned meat and tools without making bodies the proof. The camp we found smelled of smoke that had never been given a chance to go sweet. Tarps strung in a hurry and then arranged for show, a saddle draped with a strip of red cloth I recognized from a trader's cart in town. Little trophies positioned not for warmth but for anger, and we pressed in a half circle with the patience that keeps breath cheap. The first scuffle was clumsy, a tumble of limbs more than a fight, and in the mess, a thief snatched what he thought would buy him a better legend than meat or knives. Dusk's blanket, jerked from a peg where it had been drying, thrown over his shoulder like a captured flag and bolted as the sky threw a fresh squall across the ravine, a flat white that removed everything except motion and breath. I followed because the sight of that wool on the wrong back clarified the part of me that had been wobbling, and because some symbols cannot be repurchased with talk, only with hands, and behind me a raider's feet hammered the crust with the greedy rhythm of someone who wants a softer story for himself. The wind leveled the world to white and breath. The ravine became a throat with no language in it, and I pushed toward the dark knot of the blanket ahead, calling over my shoulder into the roar, not with threats I could not collect, and not with pleas I would not offer, but with the one currency that sometimes buys a pause in men who think they are owed recognition delivered without flattery, the truth that they were hired to perform a grievance they did not write and would not be allowed to profit from. that Pike's mark would not keep their bones warmer than ours, that the people who sent them would let the cold erase their names without spending a single word to retrieve them. The second man's rush shortened on that thought the way a dog breaks at a cliff, doubt putting friction in his knees, and the thief ahead, hearing his world thin behind him, looked back for the first time, which was all the math I could afford before the ground solved a different equation under our boots. Ice cracked underfoot. The ravine floor shifted. I used to think standing meant not falling. Now I know it means choosing where you'll fall if you must. And when the ice let go in a sound like a sheet tearing from the sky, the thief's footing went with it, his weight sliding into an angle that promised a head-first prayer to the creek bed. And I moved without grace but with intention, diving for the corner of the blanket the way you reach for a child's sleeve at a curb, hands closing on wet wool that burned my palms even through numbness, fabric becoming a rope in an instant, not a trophy, a line between a man and the dark, and the shock of his weight nearly hauled me over the broken lip while my knees found no purchase except the stubborn refusal to let the story end cheap. The second raider arrived with the panting certainty of a man who expects to be allowed his worst idea, saw the angle, the drop, the way my elbows shook, and hesitated in that human hinge between finishing a fight and fleeing a consequence, and the storm, which has no ethics but excellent timing, blasted a white fist across his eyes and made the decision for him. He ran, and I did not waste breath naming the mercy. Hold the edge, I told the thief, and the ridiculousness of instructing a man who had tried to buy a legend with someone else's symbol broke something that wasn't necessary, which turned out to be my pride, and he clutched the wool while I inch-walked backward, boots skidding, hips low, the way dusk had taught me to drag a sled without letting it own my spine, and the blanket stretched into that honest grown old cloth makes when asked to do more than it signed up for and still says yes, in the space of 3 heartbeats that sounded like hammers on frozen iron. Dusk and crow on wind arrived with the economy of men who save adrenaline for what deserves it, took in the geometry of ice and legs and rope cloth in one breath, and moved to make the math prefer us. Crow braced my shoulder with a palm that pinned panic back into usefulness, while Dusk belly crawled to the brake and caught the thief's forearm where the skin had gone the color of bad news, their weight and mine staking a triangle against gravity until the man could scramble his boots to a ledge and flop onto the safe side with the graceless gratitude of someone who has just negotiated with a creek and won. A rehearsed triumph. We did inventory, gathering the scattered proof of who had stoked this fire into a shape the council could read. Cuts identical to those left at our caches, a bundle of cloth woven in a pattern I had last seen in a settler's storeroom, the mark carved again, lazy and arrogant, on the haft of a tool the drifters would not have brought if someone local had not told them which insult would hurt most, and by the time we stepped back into the bowl of the village, the sky had gone to iron and the snow had chosen to fall, straight down for once, as if it too wished to witness. The council convened under that falling hush, elders and hunters and mothers with hands still wet from work, and before anyone could decorate the moment with speculation I spoke first, because my life has too often been narrated by other mouths, saying that I owed my breath to the blanket, and to those who refused to let old chains decide the new season, that I would not pay for peace with silence again. Defector named by Prince, by timing, by the 2 clean cuts that matched his habit was bound to restitution rather than spectacle, because winter demands clever justice. If you want the spring to meet anyone at all, stores to be repaid, labor to be done under watchful eyes, routes to be walked in the company of the people he had endangered, so that the cold could tutor him in what his shortcuts cost, and when some called for more dramatic verdicts, Dusk denied the theater with a shake of his head that landed like a verdict of its own, choosing, as he had from the first, stores and lines of Parley and a plan to keep both fires from leaping the fence, because pride is not a ration and cannot be eaten. I claimed my path aloud so there would be no room later for tidy misunderstandings, saying I would stay and work and answer for any harm my presence drew, that I would stand with those who had stood with me, that my debt, if debt existed, would be paid in usefulness rather than in vanishing. The storm eased without ending, which felt like the only honest resolution the day could offer, the wind stepping back a pace rather than changing its mind. And that was enough for a beginning, because beginnings do not deserve trumpets and because the human heart is more cautious than any weather. At first light I hung the mended blanket on the palisade to dry, the wet wool steaming in the new sun, while my fingers pushed the last stitch flat, and for the first time the wind carried my name back to me without distortion, not as property or rumor or case file, but as a sound I could keep.